Hello, my name is Devin Newman, and I will be covering the Advocacy Coalition Framework, or ACF for short. I will also be analyzing an article that covers a social issue change using the Advocacy Coalition Framework. I will begin my presentation on the Advocacy Coalition Framework with an overview. The ACF was created by Sabatier and Jenkins Smith. It came about through the author's desire to understand the part that technical information lends in the policy process. It was first published as a short issue of Policy Sciences, but has been revised since its first publication. The ACF is used to deal with wicked problems, which may involve goal conflicts, technical disputes, and multiple forces from various levels of government. Europe and the US are typically where applications of the ACF are most common. There have been 54 cases of the ACF since 1999, and of which about half have dealt with environmental or energy policy, but the other half have been pertaining to social issues such as drugs, culture, domestic violence, etc. There are three fundamental stones to the ACF. The first one is a macro-level assumption where most policy-making takes place among specialists such as legislators or researchers within a policy subsystem. Subsystem is defined as having both a substantive portion and a territorial one. The ACF assumes that everyday individuals wouldn't have the knowledge or the time necessary to enact meaningful, long-lasting change. The change must come from specialized policymakers that are passionate about the change desired. Policy changers' behavior is acted on by two forces, the relatively stable parameters and external systems. The second fundamental stone is the micro level, or the model of the individual. The second pillar is backed by social psychology, and I will go more in depth on it in the next slides. And the last foundational stone is a meso-level conviction, wherein the most ideal way to deal with all of these different actors and various subsystems is to just combine them into advocacy coalitions. The model of the individual, or second pillar, is one of the main ways that the ACF is differentiated from the rational choice framework. The ACF has two different systems of reasoning. The first is the logic of appropriateness. This argues that correct behavior means following the rules. This is typically set up by the party that is in power and has set the rules. The second is the logic of consequences. This argues that correct behavior means maximizing good consequences. One example of this I heard is taking one step back to take two steps forward. This is typically used by the minority party. However, experts will use both tactics of reasoning to get their policy one step further. These two different reasonings make compromise harder, but even more than that, the double shift has made compromise feel nearly impossible. The double shift is where people will view their opponents as eviler or less trustworthy or even more powerful than they actually are. I believe that the double shift has been exacerbated by both the mainstream media and social media in recent years. Too many people tend to get their news through outlets that are meant to be entertaining rather than informative, and we see this in the rise of political comedians. Also, social media has a way of pushing people farther and farther toward whatever end they gravitate to. The ads and posts become more and more extreme, with every click to capture your attention for longer. The Social Dilemma on Netflix illustrates this point really well. This transitions to the three-belief system. The first belief is deep core beliefs. These typically come from childhood, and as they sound, are deeply rooted in the core of who we are. That means these are extremely challenging to change. This is how two equally educated policymakers or change agents can look at the same subject yet come to very different conclusions. The second is policy core beliefs. These are influenced by the deep core beliefs, as almost everything is. However, these are not difficult to change due to childhood learning, but because they are system-wide in scope and deal with fundamental policy choices like free markets versus regulated markets. The last belief system is secondary beliefs. These are fairly narrow in range. An example would be the rule set in an already established program. Changes in this belief tier are easy to come by as they need less evidence and fewer people to agree on the change. We will see this come into play in the article that I analyze, where they have to target secondary beliefs because the deep core and policy beliefs are too difficult to change. This structural diagram is a good pictorial of the ACF process. Policy making occurs in geographically bound policy subsystems and typically includes actors from various levels of government, media, researchers, and more. The people trying to make a change will coordinate with partners in advocacy coalitions to influence the current policy to their liking. The ACF has two categories: relatively stable parameters and external events. The relatively stable parameters box lists 4 different parameter problems, and due to them being so solid and rarely wavering, they are typically not targeted by change agents. These stable parameters also outline the policy-making process within the policy subsystem shown on the box to the right. Policy subsystems is defined by sectional boundaries and various policy contributors from all different levels of government. Policy contributors will both train in a policy subsystem and be in that system, a subsystem, for long periods of time until their goals have been reached. Enacting change is a lengthy process that requires knowledge and long-term determination. External events are some of the best ways to enact change, and they typically require something like a disaster or a new government taking over, something pretty drastic. And in the article we analyzed, we'll see how they tried to utilize an external event, but it wasn't quite strong enough to actually make a change. Now we'll delve into the ACF's 2 paths for policy change, or at least the 2 main paths. The ACF defines policy-oriented learning as relatively enduring alternations of thought or behavioral intentions that result from experience and/or new information and that are concerned with the attainment or revision of policy objectives. But a little more simply, policy-oriented learning is the hypothesis that issues pertaining to natural systems are more malleable to change than those that are purely social. The ability for this hypothesis to bring change depends on the level of belief targeted. Deep core beliefs and policy core beliefs are not very susceptible to change considering new information. But secondary beliefs are more susceptible to change due to new information because they require less evidence and fewer change agents. Another hypothesis that the ACF argues needs to happen for change to occur are perturbations external to the subsystem focused on. This could include a regime change or natural disaster. Massive external shocks can change what is focused on in people's agendas. Redistribution of resources or the replacement of the powerful coalition by the minority coalition are a couple of the most important effects from an external perturbation. To summarize, the ACF believes that minor change can come from routine policy-oriented learning, but large-scale change or major changes are more often a result of an extreme external shock. Alternative paths to major policy change. Internal shocks can bring about just as much change as external shocks can. For example, the BP oil spill was an internal disaster that brought a lot of attention in the public spotlight on a specific policy subsystem. This spotlight created the power necessary to redistribute or draw on new resources against oil fracking in the ocean, or the demand for safety precautions. I lived in Houston at the time of the BP oil spill, and it was all over the news. Absolutely everybody knew about it. Galveston is only 30 minutes away or so, and that's what was really hit hard due to this oil spill. So it's a really great example of an internal shock bringing about change and awareness and public spotlight to something that normally doesn't get talked about. There is a difference between an external shock, something the subsystem has no control over, and an internal shock, something that the subsystem could have prevented or caused in some way, and both have the power to bring about change in unique ways. Negotiated agreements are the combination of the first hypothesis, policy-oriented learning, and the literature on alternative dispute resolution. To summarize, the ACF and the ADR have groupings of people based on similar beliefs joined together in a coalition who often digest information in different ways. They distrust their opponent's ability to negotiate fairly, and they don't believe their opponents have the capacity to understand. Now that we've done an overview of the ACF, let's look at the ACF in action. The ACF believes that people engage in politics to turn their beliefs into policy, and so this framework is best for social or cultural issues.